At the origins of depth psychology, there were not only theories, but relationships, not abstract models, but human encounters, exchanges, and tensions. Modern psychological thought was born out of dialogue and conflict, and one of the most revealing documents of this genesis is the correspondence between two figures who together laid the foundations of what we now call the psychology of the unconscious. These letters, written over the span of 7 years, are not merely a historical record, they form a living laboratory of psychoanalytic thought. Within their pages move concepts, emotions, insights, and disagreements that anticipate the most profound theoretical rupture of the 20th century, the split between a medical scientific view of the psyche and a symbolic archetypal vision of the unconscious. At the dawn of the 20th century, the nascent science of the unconscious was in a moment of extraordinary vitality. Its founder, already established, sought a successor, someone capable of carrying forward a radical yet fragile project, still struggling for recognition in a positivist academic world. The young correspondent, coming from a different cultural and medical tradition, seemed to embody that continuity. Educated, independent, and receptive to philosophy and anthropology, he represented a new sensibility, less bound to biological determinism, and more attuned to symbolic language, religion, and the myths that shape cultures. From the very beginning, their exchange took the form of an intricate weave of admiration and projection. The master saw in the disciple the future of his doctrine, while the disciple saw in the master the paternal figure who legitimized his path. But as so often in the history of ideas, the very foundation of a relationship also contained the seed of its division. A close reading of the correspondence reveals an initial phase of profound harmony. The letters express a shared conviction that psychic distress arises from unconscious dynamics and that healing occurs through speech, dreams, memory, and relationship. Yet gradually, the younger thinker began to go further. In his reflections, the unconscious ceased to be merely a repository of repressed drives. It became an autonomous, creative dimension, structured like a universal language of symbols. Psychic energy, which for the master had a biological origin, now acquired spiritual and cultural meaning. From this perspective, the dream was no longer simply the disguise of desire, but an archetypal narrative, a collective story about transformation and meaning. Here the theoretical distance emerged on one side, a psychology anchored in the medical and instinctual paradigm. On the other, a psychology oriented towards symbol, myth, and the collective language of the soul. The rupture between these two minds was not merely intellectual, it was profoundly psychological. It unfolded as a process of mutual individuation, in which each had to separate from the other, in order to become himself. The correspondence can thus be read as a kind of mutual analysis, a dialogue between two functions of the psyche, one rational, analytical and structuring, the other imaginative, symbolic and transformative. The break was not a loss, but an evolutionary passage, the moment when depth psychology split into two complementary paths, one clinical and interpretative, focused on diagnosis and individual therapy, the other phenomenological and cultural, seeking meaning in the collective psyche. In this sense, what occurred between the correspondents was a foundational event, the simultaneous birth of two ways of thinking about the mind, desire and symbol, body and imagination, ego and self. From a psychodynamic perspective, the correspondence represents a remarkable example of intellectual transference and countertransference. Between the lines emerges a complex emotional bond, a relationship of idealization, ambivalence, disappointment, and progressive emancipation. The master, who had spent his life interpreting others' minds, now experienced within himself the pain of abandonment and the resistance to losing control. The disciple, who had sought in the master a model and guide, faced the painful necessity of separation, to achieve his own theoretical and psychic autonomy. This dynamic of identification and differentiation mirrors precisely what psychoanalytic theory describes as the process of growth and individuation, the necessity of conflict as an instrument of development. Every true rupture in psychology is also a birth. More than a century later, this correspondence remains an irreplaceable document for understanding the inner evolution of depth psychology. Not only does it mark the transition from a psychoanalysis centered on childhood and sexuality to a psychology that embraces myth, art, and religion, but it also reveals how every theory of the mind is born from human encounter. Within those letters, one senses that the science of the soul cannot exist apart from the drama of relationship. That psychological thought, to remain alive, must contain within itself the tension between two poles: order and chaos, reason and imagination, master and disciple. And perhaps this is, the deepest legacy of those pages, that the knowledge of the psyche is never achieved through certainty, but through dialogue, dissonance, and, the courage of dissent. Today, studying that correspondence means returning to the moment when psychology became both history and biography, when theory intertwined with emotion, and scientific inquiry with the human search for meaning. Those letters remind us that psychoanalysis and, honestly, all study of the mind, was not born in laboratories alone, but in relationships, in silences, in words written by hand. Within them still lives the question that continues to haunt every therapist, scholar, and self-observing soul. How far can we truly know the mind without losing ourselves within it?